Hey, welcome back to the Waste World podcast. I'm your host, Gage Edwards, and today we're diving into a big topic, one that could send ripples through the plastics and recycling industry for years to come. We're talking about the political and policy landscape shaping the future of recycled plastics, specifically what President Trump's proposed One Big Beautiful Bill will do, how policy is shifting the producers, recyclers, brands, their outlook on things, what that impact is, and what that means for the future. One of the themes you'll figure out today is the future's kind of uncertain, and we're not really sure what we're getting into because things seem to be changing quickly. But joining me to give us some insight and some thoughts on what is happening with the future of recycled plastics in that industry is Emily Friedman, a recycled plastics specialist and senior editor at ICIS, where she covers pricing trends, market shifts, and policy impacts around the globe. In this episode, we'll unpack what policy could mean for recycled content targets, explore how companies are adjusting their sustainability goals, and look at where the market is headed as political and economic forces collide. So whether you're deep in the plastics industry or just trying to follow the signal through the noise, I know I am, this one's worth sticking around for. Enjoy. My guest today is Emily Friedman, senior editor at ICIS and one of the leading voices tracking the recycled plastics market. She's been covering everything from rPET to chemical recycling, brand commitments, ESG pressure, and how policy is influencing supply chains around the world. Emily, welcome to the Waste World podcast. I'm happy to have you here. How are you?
Very happy to be here, Gage. Thank you for letting me jump on and hopefully share a little bit about what's going on in the world of recycling.
I feel like today's going to be a learning experience to me because I'm not totally shut out of what's happening with policy, but a lot of it is surprising and I'm always learning new things. So I'm happy to have someone here to kind of educate me as well.
We can bounce ideas off each other just because I would admit, in many cases with this, I'm a jack of many trades, master of few, and policy is one of those that you can get really in the weeds on some of these big bills.
And it's just so dry sometimes. I'm like, oh no, what am I reading? All right. Well, before we get into that, I want to kind of give your introduction to our audience. So Emily, who are you? What do you do? What's kind of your thing? What is the Emily Friedman story?
Yeah, happy to. So like you mentioned, I'm a senior editor at ICIS. For those of you who aren't familiar with ICIS, we are a global provider of data and intelligence surrounding various commodity markets. Most of those markets are within the petrochemical chain, so anything from crude and nat gas all the way down to plastic resin. And where I sit in that chain is at the very end, or I guess the beginning of a new life, recycled plastic. So I'm covering recycled polyethylene terephthalate, also known as rPET, alongside high-density polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, and recycled polypropylene. So the three main polymers that are used in a lot of fast-moving consumer goods and packaging, amongst other materials. What that looks like is I'm chatting with recyclers, waste companies, brand companies, and packaging converters and other converters in between every single week, trying to get a pulse on what is going on in these markets.
Very cool. Very, very, very cool. Very interesting. So hopefully everyone here has like a good idea of like, okay, when Emily's talking, I better be listening because that's how I feel. Especially I've interviewed you before. I've seen you at panels, and I'm like, okay, this is good stuff. Let's put it to paper. Of course, this time we're doing a podcast. So let's jump into kind of why we're here today. And I'm going to keep this pretty apolitical. We're talking about how it's affecting recycled the market. The One Big Beautiful Bill. And how that's playing into things. So this bill, let's kind of understand what's actually in it. How does it potentially affect the plastics and recycling industries? What are you seeing?
I hate to disappoint, Gage. Unfortunately, I have not had a chance really to dig into the meat of the One Big Beautiful Bill
Sure.
just yet. So I can't speak to the zenith of how some of those policies within the bill will affect the recycled plastic space. At a high level, something I am immediately aware of, though, is there is some changes to the U.S. food stamps program. And we do think that could have some impact on food and beverage consumer goods demand. And again, that is one of the main end markets for recycled plastic. So any changes to that industry or that end market could mean additional cost pressure on packaging and thus more cost pressure on recycled plastic.
The contrast between like Biden era policies, like with what the EPA has, and I guess this food issue. What are we seeing there?
Definitely a different tone amid the two different administrations. We
Mm-hmm.
saw a lot of green and sustainability oriented policy passed during Biden's administration, and unfortunately, a lot of that stripped back now during the Trump administration. I do think it's fair to point out that, actually Trump did sign the Save Our Seas Act 2.0 back in his first term. But unfortunately, what we've seen out of his current term is the removal of a lot of those infrastructure and sustainability oriented funds, for example, from the IRA and the, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name. I want to cut it, but what is that? Can you remind me what it's like IIJA or something like that? The
Ooh,
Infrastructure and Jobs Act?
uh,
Infrastructure.
yep.
Anyway, I'll just
That
pick
sounds
up.
good to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've seen some removal of funds for sustainability programs. Most explicitly, in terms of what's impacted recycling, we saw Eastman lose their Department of Energy grant related to the solar panels and the solar power that was going to be used at their Longview, Texas
Mm.
methanolysis facility, which was going to be a chemical recycling facility for PET. So, all that to be said, the sentiment has definitely changed at a federal level, and not that that has immediate impacts on other brands and individual companies and what they're choosing to do in terms of their packaging or their materials. It definitely sets the tone that if they aren't the superstars that we've seen them try to be these last few years, they're not going to get a slap on the wrist necessarily. And maybe they won't see as much federal action on unifying policies that would mean more recycled content, for example.
Yeah, I that kind of dives into what I want to talk about next is like who was impacted the most for thinking industry or companies. It sounds like more industry right away and then companies just down the line, or like if they're not being held as accountable as they were before, if the bill gains momentum. Is that what you're kind of leading into?
Yes, definitely a change in climate, and partially due to the direct actions of the current administration and their agenda on sustainability. So that's part of it, but also partly due to the indirect actions of their trade policies, which, as we know, have had massive waves among the global economic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really changed demand outlooks across many industries. Does not consumer goods and packaging, but also construction, other durable goods, automotive, etc. So the slowdowns in those industries alongside packaging has been the most direct hit to the recycled plastic space, again, because of that price pressure. Typically, recycled plastics are coming at a premium. And when people are looking for things to cut costs, this would be an option, unfortunately.
Yeah, last time we spoke, we talked tariffs, and I feel like if anything, we're at least given something to keep us on our toes through this administration. you know,
Uncertainty is definitely the word of the year.
yeah. So let's talk about a little bit of that. So bills like this, even the tariffs, how sensitive is the recycled plastics market to these kinds of changes? It must be pretty volatile.
So it really is polymer specific.
Mhm.
And the good news is, for the most part, the recycled plastics industry in the US has been left out of direct impacts from tariffs. Now, let me break that down. The main polymer that we see international trade for recycled plastics is rPET. We import heavily from Asia, from Latin America, even parts of Africa, in the form of rPET flake and rPET pellet. Though we did see that rPET and PET are exempt from these reciprocal tariffs according to the Annex 2 listing, which had the trade code 390761 or 69. So that more or less made it a non-issue for those imports. And unfortunately for domestic producers, has not helped them whatsoever. We still see very competitive import price rPET flake and rPET pellet here in the US. So that was one piece of it. The other piece is when we're importing plastic scrap, most of it is coming from our two neighbors, Canada and Mexico. We don't
Mhm.
typically pull in a lot of plastic scrap from other countries. We generate so much of it here. A lot of what we need to use for the industry is what's generated here. But because Mexico and Canada we're kind of labeled as exempt if the good is USMCA compliant, which is the US Mexico Canada agreement, um, which most recycled plastic scrap is going to be compliant. Again, a non-issue in that case. Uh, but if you look wider, so beyond the direct, is my stuff going to cost more? The answer for recycled plastics is mostly no. But now that everything else is costing more, again, it goes back to that conversation of how can we cut costs elsewhere and where that premium for these recycled resins is really under a lot of scrutiny.
All right, so let's step back from there. So the broader state of the recycled plastics market right now, what's hot, what's struggling, what are we seeing?
I wish I could call what I'm seeing hot. Unfortunately, it is very, very cold
Okay.
for most of these, despite the fact that we're in the middle of the summer. We've seen dramatic drops in price across many different recycled plastic commodities. So I'll just pick on two, which are kind of front and center right now. The first being rPET. We've seen PET bale feedstock costs more than half in the last month or so. This was partly expected because in the summer, people drink more bottled beverages, maybe water because they're hot. Then hopefully they're recycling those. So there's more supply of feedstock in the summer. That tends to mean that pricing would soften if because of growing supply. But what has made this a disastrous moment instead of a typical seasonal softening is at the same time we've seen intense withdrawal of demand from recyclers who are either importing their flake feedstocks or are just not seeing great end product demand for rPET pellet and thus they don't need as much bale. So bales have crashed, thus rPET flake and pellet prices are also coming down. Similarly, not for the same reasons, but we are seeing a similar trend on natural HDPE bale prices. Again, this would be like milk jugs. This goes into the natural post-consumer recycled HD resin that is very popular. Seeing again a more than half of the halving of the price. What was $1.05, $1.08 bale has now become a 45 or 50 cent per pound bale. Very quick. I mean, if you call that over the last, say, 2 months, so from the end of May, but a lot of fat has come out of that market, and I think pellet prices are still struggling to keep up. What I will say about recycled HD and how it's different from rPET is recycled HD, we've seen this cycle now, this will be the third time. So prices will peak because there's just not enough milk jug supply to meet current PCR demand. And then because prices are so high, you lose a little bit of that demand to the point where recyclers stop buying the bales. Prices then crash because a MRF or a material recovery facility has to move those recycled bales no matter what. And then prices slowly start to rise again. So we've just witnessed the crash. This was after a crash in summer of 2023. So again, that 2 year mark, 1.5, 2 years. And I'm sure by this fall, winter timeframe, we'll see that market start to come alive once again.
Well, I like how the conversation has been about uncertainty, but it's like, oh, well, there's a little bit of optimism on the end there. Well, we might see it come back, We're on our way.
There's definitely some fundamentals. Yeah.
All right. So if we're looking at global trends, and I know there's a lot of uncertainty, but is there anything out there that's kind of shaping the US market? Maybe that's going on in the next year or two. I know things change constantly. So if there's just like any crystal ball moment you have, you're like, oh, well, maybe this.
On the global stage, we definitely are looking towards the next negotiations of the UN Global Plastics Treaty. So that's coming
Mhm.
up starting August 5th through the 14th in Geneva. It's very unclear if the US would be a party to any agreement that they can come to. I do believe we are sending a delegation, so that is positive. But at the end of the day, I think the world has realized how difficult the issue of plastics production and plastics waste is to tackle with so many economies on the line on both sides, where recycled plastics supports some economies and plastics production supports others. So that could definitely bring about change if by some miracle we do see a signed agreement and the US is participating. But outside of that, on a global stage, Europe is kind of still doing their own thing, moving forward with the Single-Use Plastics Directive, and then preparing for the PPWR. In Asia, we're seeing increased waste bans, which can somewhat harm the US market because we do export some plastic scrap to various Asian countries. So most recently, we saw Malaysia kind of close their borders to non-Basel Convention countries, and
Hmm.
the US is not a participant in the Basel Convention, so kind of excludes us de facto. So we're keeping our eye out for those waste bans as well as any future recycled content minimums in some of these Asian countries. India had one that was supposed to start this year, but eventually became delayed. India sends us a lot of our pet, so if they have local consumption, that could change what gets sent over here, for example, and what supply
Hmm.
is available for import. So a few things here and there, but overall, really looking at that global plastics treaty, and most everything else is more kind of on the U.S. federal level, U.S. state level.
Gotcha. Now let's talk about, I guess, some of those imports, exports. How are major brands, responding to a lot of what's going on? Maybe that is this uncertainty, some of this policy that's being pushed around, the importing, exporting that we're kind of seeing differences on in the tariffs. What are brands doing? Are they still just kind of like rolling with the punches here? Like, did we see any changes from them?
Definitely a mixed bag. So in some cases, because of the global supply chain uncertainty, some brands and converters have made the choice to try to open up domestic pathways for recycled plastic supply. So, right when those first wave of tariffs were passed in April, I had a lot of conversations with recyclers who said they were getting calls from folks they hadn't heard from in quite a while. And I do think that could be attributed to, folks trying to freshen up some of those relationships with domestic producers. But others have taken the opposite approach. Import again comes at a cost deficit, so it's attractive in that way. And because there's this increasing cost pressure on goods, we have seen companies become more open to imported material where in the past they might not have been. So because RPET is exempt, that has bolstered, I think, the confidence of some converters and brands that they can still rely on those feedstocks from overseas.
Now, we talked a little bit about global markets, and I feel bad asking you this question because uncertainty is the name of the game. When I feel like we talk, it's like, well, this could change next week. Last time we talked, it was right before one of the tariff deadlines, and like, who knows if this is relevant next week? So here we are again. I'm looking at 12 to 18 months. Recyclers, resin producers, packaging companies. What should they be watching? How should they tune into this changing environment?
I wish I could say that we'd have certainty,
Sure, sure.
12 months, 18 months from now, but given the experience of the last almost 8 months at this point, I am very doubtful, unfortunately, that this will not still be a lingering issue then from a trade policy perspective. But
Mhm.
one of the key things I think various brands or converters should take away from this is that right now we are seeing a period of weakness for recyclers. It's been a difficult 3 years, ever since 2022, when many markets had to take a step back on weaker demand. Recycling was no different. And we've already seen some closures or partial closures of recycling facilities here in the US. At least one RPET facility had closed on the East Coast. We saw an HGPE recycler close kind of in the Midwest, and even a partial closure of another RPET player on the West Coast. So, as brands and converters are making these very difficult cost decisions, and they may think, well, we just don't have the funding to support these PCR programs right now, but we'll come back to it later. If you step away from these markets, you're leaving these recyclers in a very difficult position. And unfortunately, they might not be there when you need them later down the line. So I would really just encourage market players to think about their long-term sourcing strategy and needs and to keep those relationships in mind because, again, nothing is guaranteed, as we've learned over the last 5 years. And if you don't build that environment now, build the capacity now, again, it just won't be there when all of a sudden you're ready, to pull the trigger on those programs.
Well said. So everyone at home, make sure you're listening. That's key advice. Key advice. Emily, anything I haven't covered today that you want to dive into? Something that is something you're working on that wasn't part of my talking points today.
No, I feel like we covered the bases, though I will be looking throughout the rest of this year to see any other brands that do change their sustainability goals. We have seen several brands already this year reduce their goals, push them out to 2035, for example. And I think more will come in that same line, but we won't really know the full suite of changes probably until the end of this year. And that's going to guide the ambition and the demand forecast for the next 10 years, probably. So, a pivotal point that we're in this year, we've come really far when you think about this cost sensitive industry where people were only buying recycled plastic to save money. And now it's very much sustainability driven. But again, a long way to go between now and that next goal, again, usually in 2035.
Well, I anticipate reading some of your articles and research for the rest of the year because I'm gonna need to keep up also, and I feel like you're a good resource. So, if someone else wants to follow up on what you're doing, where can they find you? Where can they see your work?
Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I believe it's under Emily Ann Bautista Friedman on LinkedIn. And then I'm happy, again, from there, if we want to start a chat on LinkedIn, to provide my email so they can get in touch with me that way.
Excellent. Well, cool. Emily, thank you for joining me. This was very insightful. Even though if we take away in certain, we don't know, but we're trying, I thank you for the chat, and I appreciate you being here.
No, so happy to talk, Gage, and hopefully next time we have more good things than bad to discuss, but it's always changing, like you said.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Big thanks to Emily Friedman for joining the show and breaking down what new policy could hold for us and mean for the plastics and recycling space, and for reminding us that the markets don't operate in a vacuum. They move with policy, politics, and pressure, and if you take away anything, things get a little uncertain sometimes. But there are professionals like Emily, myself, just kidding, that will help us through those times and help keep us up to date and navigate those changes. If you want to keep up with what Emily's reporting on and insights, check out her work over at ICIS.com and follow her for updates on pricing, recycled content, and sustainability shifts happening across the industry. And if you like this episode, help us keep the Waste World podcast growing. Make sure you follow, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. Hit those buttons, share the show, tell your team. It helps us bring on more brilliant guests like Emily and keep the conversation sharp and relevant. Thanks again for tuning in. And remember, it's our world. Let's not waste it.